In the summer of 1923, in the sparsely settled highlands of western Montana, the small town of Granite Creek presented a landscape simultaneously serene and unforgiving. Nestled among ponderosa pines and jagged ridges, the region had long been characterized by its harsh winters, occasional forest fires, and a persistent tension between human habitation and the natural environment. Granite Creek, at an elevation of roughly 5,400 feet, was home to fewer than 200 residents, most of whom were miners, loggers, or small-scale farmers. Water was drawn from narrow mountain streams. The roads were often little more than dirt tracks, and the nearest railroad station, some 20 miles away, meant that outside news and supplies arrived infrequently. It was in this environment of isolation and practicality that one man, whose name would later surface in accounts of the region's unusual survival stories, began to make decisions that would draw both ridicule and skepticism from his neighbors. His name was Elias Harrow, a former surveyor turned itinerant carpenter who had arrived in Granite Creek the previous spring. At 42, with a stooped posture earned from decades of measuring mountain contours and hauling timber, Harrow possessed the kind of quiet determination that often goes unnoticed in communities accustomed to outspoken authority figures. His skills were documented in a modest portfolio: bridges over small creeks, cabins for miners, and occasional timber-framed barns. Yet it was a project he undertook in June of 1923 that would sharply distinguish him from his neighbors' expectations and, at least temporarily, mark him as the subject of local amusement. Harrow had acquired a parcel of land on the eastern slope of Clearview Ridge, a rise notorious for its exposure to summer winds and, more ominously, to the region's sporadic wildfire activity. The lot measured just over 2 acres, rocky and uneven, interspersed with patches of lodgepole pine and scattered granite outcrops. While most residents in Granite Creek preferred to build their homes on level ground, elevated slightly from the valley floor to avoid seasonal runoff, Harrow surveyed the slope and identified what he referred to in his notes as a natural depression approximately 4 feet deep, 8 by 12 feet, oriented to capture sunlight from the southeast. His plan, as outlined in correspondence preserved in the Granite Creek Historical Society, was straightforward yet unconventional. He intended to construct a cabin that was partially embedded into the hillside, with the lower walls essentially forming part of the slope itself. The roof would extend slightly beyond the excavation, covered with native sod and soil, creating a subtle, nearly camouflaged mound. Dimensions were modest, 10 by 14 feet internally, with ceilings of just over 6 feet, sufficient for daily living but without excess. Ventilation shafts would run along the roofline and the north wall, permitting airflow while maintaining the insulation properties of the earthen walls. Harrow justified the design in technical terms. Earth-sheltered structures would provide thermal stability, reduce exposure to wind, and, though he did not frame it in dramatic terms at the time, potentially offer a degree of protection from the wildfire-prone forests that fringed the ridge. When Harrow first shared sketches and plans with the few neighbors he trusted, reactions were largely incredulous. Mrs. Clara Duval, whose husband operated a nearby sawmill, recounted later that she had laughed until her sides ached at the notion of a half-buried, hobbit-like shack in the middle of a slope that most considered unsuitable for conventional construction. Mr. Tom Weller, a veteran logger known for his blunt assessments, dismissed Harrow's ideas as the ramblings of a man who measures rocks for amusement. Even the town's local mason, Samuel Keaton, offered what he described as professional advice wrapped in civility, warning that the soil of Clearview Ridge was unstable, prone to minor landslides after summer rains, and likely to undermine any structure built partially underground. Yet Harrow remained methodical and meticulous. He documented soil composition, measured moisture retention across several weeks, and charted the slope's angle at 28 degrees, steeper than most building codes of the era would allow. He noted the density of surrounding vegetation, identifying clusters of fire-prone shrubs and deadfall that he intended to clear selectively, thereby reducing immediate fuel near the cabin. In his journal, he wrote of a balance between exposure and concealment, a phrase that would later seem prescient but, at the time, was met with eye rolls. Construction began in early July under clear skies and temperatures averaging 75 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Harrow first excavated the depression, using a combination of hand tools and a borrowed mule-drawn cart to remove the rocky soil. The neighbors watched with a mix of curiosity and scorn. On several occasions, children from nearby homesteads would peek over the ridge, daring one another to imagine living like a mole underground. Adults offered commentary from a distance predicting structural collapse, flooding during thunderstorms, or simply the futility of attempting to live without proper siding and framing. Harrow proceeded with his plan undeterred. He framed the cabin using hewn lodgepole pine, lining the excavated walls with tightly fitted timbers. Each beam was anchored into the surrounding rock and soil using iron brackets that he forged himself, a skill acquired during his years as a traveling carpenter. The roof, a shallow gable, was reinforced with crossbeams and then layered with planks in a combination of clay and soil. Finally, he carefully applied a sod covering, planting grass and small alpine wildflowers along the top. The result was a structure that, from the valley below, appeared as nothing more than a modest mound, blending seamlessly into the hillside. Initial reactions to the completed cabin were a mixture of bewilderment and amusement. On July 30th, the Granite Creek Gazette published a brief note under the headline, "Harrow's Hidden Home. Innovative or inane?" The reporter, one George Pendleton, described the cabin as a curious affair more akin to an earthen burrow than a dwelling for a man accustomed to chairs, stoves, and other civilized comforts. Pendleton quoted several townspeople, including Mrs. Duval, who offered the observation that Elias might be the only man foolish enough to sleep beneath the dirt without complaint. The ridicule was not limited to printed commentary. During market days, townspeople would speculate on how Harrow would manage basic necessities such as cooking, laundry, and social visits. Some suggested that the cabin would be unbearably damp, that rodents would infiltrate the underground spaces, or that summer storms would turn the structure into a muddy tomb. Even those who respected Harrow's skills acknowledged the risk, if not the impracticality, of living partially underground on a slope historically prone to wildfires. Harrow, for his part, rarely offered rebuttal. He kept a journal and technical drawings recording observations about sunlight penetration, soil temperature, and airflow. Letters preserved in the Montana Historical Archives reveal that he was conscious of the skepticism, but appeared to regard it as peripheral to the task at hand. He noted on August 3, 1923, "The slope is stable, the timber is secure, the roof retains heat without artificial insulation. Doubt will follow. I remain concerned only with measured outcomes." As summer progressed, the tension within Granite Creek subtly shifted. While many residents continued to regard Harrow's endeavor with amusement or mild derision, an undercurrent of curiosity developed. Observers noted the structure's appearance: no smoke stains, no obvious damage from heavy rains, and remarkably little wind disturbance. Children began to speculate less about the cabin collapsing and more about what it might be like inside. Yet by the end of August, with temperatures climbing into the high 80s and the region remaining tinder dry after a nearly rainless month, the prevailing sentiment among most adults remained one of unease. The ridge, covered in dry brush and standing deadfall, presented the sort of risk that, in the memory of longtime residents, had resulted in several small but destructive fires over the previous 2 decades. By mid-September, a week had passed without any rain, and the local forest rangers issued warnings about increasing wildfire danger. Harrow's cabin, still untested by any extreme condition, became a subject of hushed conversation. Would the earth-sheltered design truly offer any advantage, or had the neighbors' laughter been well-founded? There was no answer yet, only anticipation shadowed by skepticism. And so, as autumn approached, the stage was set. A man had quietly constructed an unconventional home, blending it into a landscape notorious for its volatility. He had ignored ridicule, documented his methods meticulously, and placed his trust in principles not widely understood in his community. Neighbors continued to shake their heads and mutter predictions of eventual failure, leaving Harrow alone in the mound of timber and earth, with nothing to show but a structure whose merit remained entirely untested. At this point, Granite Creek itself seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered through the pines, the slope remained dry and silent, and the townspeople returned to their routines, leaving the half-buried cabin perched on the ridge like an unresolved question. No event had yet tested the limits of its design, and no external authority had intervened to validate or condemn it. Skepticism prevailed, tension lingered, and the first hints of impending trial, though invisible to all, were already in the air. October of 1923 arrived with an unusual dryness that the residents of Granite Creek could not recall in living memory. By the first week, the earth beneath the forest floor had hardened to a shade of ochre, and every gust of wind carried a whisper of potential disaster. Local rangers, increasingly concerned by the persistent absence of precipitation, had begun to patrol the ridges more frequently, noting the accelerated accumulation of deadwood and underbrush. Fire breaks, where they existed at all, were narrow and irregular, and most homesteads were constructed from highly flammable timber, their roofs lined with dry shingles susceptible to spontaneous ignition from sparks carried by the wind. Harrow's cabin, half hidden in its earthen mound, remained a curiosity rather than a subject of practical concern. Its low profile on the slope rendered it almost invisible from the valley, and though a few persistent neighbors occasionally walked the ridge to peek at its construction, no one paid serious attention to it. Yet inside his modest shelter, Harrow had begun subtle modifications aimed at long-term resilience. He had installed a simple water cistern fed by a diverted spring upstream, insulated with earth and lined with clay to prevent leakage. The interior walls were coated with a thin layer of lime plaster, a measure he had learned from a treatise on European hill dwellings, both to stabilize humidity and to deter small rodents. Smoke from the small stove vented through a narrow flue, and Harrow observed that the structure's thermal mass maintained an even temperature even during the cold autumn nights, a fact that he documented in meticulous daily notes. Meanwhile, the town's larger settlement remained oblivious to the imminent danger. On October 9th, a small spark from a passing train ignited the parched undergrowth along the valley floor. Within hours, the fire had grown, fed by dry grass, fallen pine needles, and accumulated dead wood, moving up the slopes with a speed that stunned local residents. Farmers and loggers attempted to create fire breaks using shovels and axes, but their efforts were largely reactive and, as history would later record, tragically insufficient. The first signs of panic were audible. Distant shouts, the barking of dogs, and the hurried clatter of wagon wheels along dirt tracks. Families gathered essential belongings, livestock was herded to less flammable areas, and townspeople braced themselves for the inferno's inevitable advance. From his vantage point partially embedded in the hillside, Harrow observed the approach of the flames with a measured, almost clinical detachment. In his journal entry for October 10th, he noted, "The fire advances from the valley, climbing the ridge at an estimated rate of 12 feet per minute. Wind velocity approximately 15 miles per hour from the southwest. Ember showers are frequent. Fuel remains dense. Observations confirm anticipated exposure conditions. Structural envelope remains intact." It was an entry that, had it been read at the time, might have been dismissed as the musings of a man excessively devoted to precision in the face of widespread alarm. The townspeople, in contrast, experienced the fire as a chaotic, nearly incomprehensible phenomenon. By mid-afternoon, the flames had reached the lower slopes of Clearview Ridge. Panicked families formed impromptu lines to douse embers with buckets, while others frantically cleared brush with axes. Smoke was dense, tinged with acrid resin from burning pines, and the heat intensified as the wildfire climbed. Many observers later described the scene as apocalyptic, walls of flame stretching 20 to 30 feet high, carrying sparks in their wake, with gusts fanning the fire unpredictably across narrow valleys and ridges. Harrow's cabin, partially subterranean and covered with a dense layer of sod and earth, was approached by the fire front without incident. Neighbors witnessing from below reported later that a mound sat upon the hill, seemingly untouched, while all around it blazed. Their astonishment was compounded by the fact that structures built on flatter, more conventional sites, log cabins with raised foundations and pitched roofs, were already succumbing to flame. The distinction was stark. Conventional wisdom, which had guided building practices for decades, had failed in a matter of hours, whereas Harrow's unconventional design had endured. Observers climbed cautiously toward the ridge, expecting collapse or evidence of damage. Smoke had drifted across the hillside, but the cabin's earthen exterior appeared intact. The flue vents were releasing wisps of white smoke from Harrow's stove, indicating that he remained inside, performing routine observations and logging measurements. Some villagers speculated that the structure might simply be a fluke, surviving due to its position on a slope that the fire front had inexplicably bypassed. Others whispered that Harrow had employed some unknown method, a craft learned from foreign manuals or esoteric experience, to render the cabin impervious to fire. Inside, Harrow maintained his daily discipline. He recorded temperature differentials between the interior and exterior, documented the behavior of the wind, and noted ember impacts on the sod roof. He observed that the thermal mass of the earth absorbed radiant heat from the flames, delaying temperature increases inside the cabin by nearly 30 minutes compared to exposed structures. He also recorded minor surface scorching on the roof sod layer, but no structural compromise. His notes, precise and unemotional, reflected the satisfaction of validation, not in triumphant terms, but in the quiet accumulation of evidence. By nightfall, the wildfire had moved past the ridge, leaving a path of scorched earth and smoldering remnants. The townspeople, exhausted and in shock, began surveying losses. Homes were reduced to charred skeletons of timber, fencing had collapsed, and livestock enclosures were destroyed. Amid this widespread devastation, Harrow emerged from his cabin as he had each evening, calm and unscathed. Neighbors gathering on the ridge below exchanged incredulous glances. Those who had once mocked the half-buried dwelling now approached cautiously, hesitant to acknowledge aloud the stark contrast between destruction and survival. Yet even in this moment of quiet astonishment, skepticism lingered. Several townspeople argued that the fire's path had simply veered around the cabin, attributing its survival to chance rather than design. Others speculated about hidden ditches, water reservoirs, or defensive techniques that might explain the anomaly. A few, more openly candid, admitted privately that they had underestimated the potential of earth-sheltered structures, but no formal acknowledgement was yet offered. The event remained, for the majority of Granite Creek, a puzzling outlier rather than a paradigm shift. Harrow, as always, remained methodical. He allowed no celebration, only documentation. His journal entry for the evening of October 12th read, "Fire has passed. Structural integrity maintained. No breach observed. Exterior scorching minimal. Observations continue. Further measurement of post-event soil stability recommended." even as neighbors gawked and whispered. Harrow's perspective remained clinical. The cabin's performance was data, not spectacle. At the close of that day, Granite Creek faced an uncertain future. The fire had revealed both vulnerability and resilience, destruction and anomaly. Residents began to rebuild, but the question of what methods might prevent similar devastation in the future remained unresolved. And while some cast lingering doubt upon Harrow's design, others quietly began to reconsider assumptions long held about construction, landscape, and survival. For now, the half-buried cabin stood alone on Clearview Ridge, uncelebrated, unremarkable in appearance, yet quietly defiant in the aftermath of one of the most destructive events in the region's recorded memory. Its story was only beginning, and the true measure of its unconventional design, as well as the long-term implications for architectural thinking in wildfire-prone regions, remained to be fully understood. In the weeks following the wildfire, Granite Creek was marked by a mixture of reconstruction, reflection, and lingering unease. The landscape bore the scars of the October blaze. Blackened trunks of ponderosa pines jutted skyward like charred sentinels, and the underbrush remained smoldering in isolated pockets. Residents moved deliberately among the ruins of their homes, salvaging what they could, assessing damage and contemplating the next steps in rebuilding their lives. Amid this somber activity, Harrow's cabin on Clearview Ridge remained untouched, almost imperceptibly blending into the ridge's contours, a quiet anomaly in the midst of widespread devastation. Despite the cabin's survival, official acknowledgement of Harrow's design was absent. Granite Creek had no formal council to evaluate building practices, and the local newspaper offered only a brief, cautiously phrased notice. One structure endures, while others fall. The article did not attribute the survival to design, materials, or construction techniques, leaving the interpretation open to conjecture. Some townspeople, wary of admitting that their conventional methods had failed, suggested that Harrow's cabin was an exception, a curiosity whose relevance to broader practice was uncertain. Harrow, however, was unperturbed by both public opinion and the absence of formal recognition. He resumed his routine of meticulous observation, now with a particular focus on post-fire conditions. He measured the soil temperature within the cabin at multiple depths, noting the insulation effect of the surrounding earth. Surface temperatures on the roof, where scorched sod had blackened slightly, were recorded at a peak of 187 degrees Fahrenheit during the fire, while interior temperatures remained stable at 72 degrees, a remarkable differential, he noted, reflecting the Earth's capacity to buffer heat. Harrow's attention to detail extended to moisture content in the soil, airflow patterns through the ventilation shafts, and structural stress on each timber joint. Local residents, meanwhile, continued to approach the ridge, often in small, hesitant groups. Many remained cautious, voicing doubts about whether the cabin's endurance was the result of careful design or mere fortuity. The fire might have spared it by accident, some muttered, pointing to the irregular trajectory of flames across the ridge. Others speculated that subterranean moisture or hidden water channels could have influenced outcomes, though no evidence supported such claims. Even those who had once mocked Harrow's burrow hesitated to ridicule him openly now. The survival of the cabin had silenced the most overt expressions of derision. In the absence of broader acceptance, Harrow began corresponding with a small network of engineers and architects in neighboring states, sharing his observations and measurements in detail. His letters, precise and unembellished, described the cabin's construction, material choices, and post-fire performance. Responses varied. Some recipients expressed mild curiosity, others skepticism, and a few suggested experimental replication under controlled conditions. Harrow documented each reply in his journal, noting the prevailing tendency to discount unconventional methods in favor of established construction norms. By November, the town's immediate priorities had shifted to winter preparedness. Granite Creek faced early snowfall and sub-freezing temperatures at night. Harrow's earth-sheltered cabin, insulated by soil and sod, maintained a remarkably stable interior climate. He recorded daily interior temperatures averaging 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal fuel required for the stove. Neighboring homes, in contrast, struggled to retain heat efficiently, consuming large quantities of firewood to stave off the cold. This contrast, though noted in passing by a few residents, did not immediately translate into formal recognition of Harrow's methods. Economic and social factors also influenced perceptions. Many townspeople whose livelihoods depended on timber saw little incentive to adopt earth-sheltered designs. The conventional log cabin, requiring abundant lumber and straightforward construction techniques, remained the standard for both economic and cultural reasons. Harrow's approach, though technically validated by the recent fire, was considered labor-intensive and unconventional, demanding both technical skill and a willingness to deviate from familiar norms. As a result, broader experimentation was limited, and the cabin remained largely isolated as an example of unconventional survival. Despite this, subtle evidence of Harrow's foresight began to accumulate. During a minor snowstorm in mid-December, neighbors observed that the slope immediately surrounding the cabin had significantly less snow accumulation than similar open areas. Harrow's excavation and the Earth's heat retention created microclimatic conditions that prevented excessive snow buildup, reducing structural stress on the roof. Small mammals such as squirrels and rabbits were seen avoiding the cabin's immediate vicinity, possibly deterred by soil compactness and human activity, minimizing the risk of rodent damage, another practical benefit that went largely unnoticed at the time. Harrow continued to expand his journal, blending empirical measurement with careful commentary. He noted that conventional wisdom, which had long guided settlement and construction practices in Granite Creek, had overlooked the latent properties of earth-sheltered structures. Soil mass, thermal inertia, and fire-resistant characteristics of sod-covered roofs, all principles familiar in other regions of Europe and Asia, had been dismissed locally, largely due to unfamiliarity and entrenched habits. Harrow's methodical documentation, he believed, could bridge this gap, though recognition was slow to arrive. Social dynamics in Granite Creek reflected this tension. While a few curious residents occasionally asked to examine the cabin, most maintained a polite distance, still unsure whether to regard Harrow as a prudent visionary or an eccentric. Children who had once peeked at the half-buried structure with mock trepidation now treated it with quiet respect, often lingering nearby to watch Harrow measure, record, or repair minor details. Adults, however, maintained a cautious ambivalence, unwilling to openly challenge prevailing norms, but increasingly aware that their assumptions about construction and safety had been questioned. By the end of December, Granite Creek had settled into a rhythm of cautious winter survival. The half-buried cabin, largely hidden from the casual observer, had become a silent focal point of discussion among those most attuned to post-fire consequences. Harrow, maintaining his methodical routine, continued to gather data, analyze soil properties, and monitor the small effects of wind, temperature, and snow on his shelter. The cabin's continued performance reinforced its unconventional promise, though it remained an uncelebrated anomaly rather than a widely accepted model. As the first weeks of 1924 unfolded, the story of Elias Harrow and his earth-sheltered cabin began to circulate more widely, carried in fragments through letters, brief newspaper notices, and word-of-mouth accounts from neighbors and traveling merchants. Skepticism remained, but so did curiosity. Among engineers, builders, and surveyors in nearby counties, discussions arose about the potential applications of partially underground dwellings in fire-prone regions. Yet no formal trials were conducted, and the majority of Granite Creek's residents continued rebuilding in the traditional style, constrained by resources, habit, and social expectations. Thus, the stage was set for the next phase of observation. Harrow's initial validation, the survival of the wildfire, had produced empirical evidence, but it had not yet shifted prevailing authority or practice. Questions lingered. Would his methods withstand subsequent environmental challenges, or had fortune alone determined the cabin's survival? Could such techniques be replicated reliably, or were they only suitable for a singular idiosyncratic circumstance? The answers remained unknown, leaving both the observer and the community suspended in a state of cautious anticipation. And so, Granite Creek entered the new year with its conventional structures, rebuilt or replaced, its social hierarchies largely intact, and the half-buried cabin of Elias Harrow standing quietly above the slope, an unassuming testament to a method that few were yet willing to accept, and a subtle reminder that innovation often meets doubt before acknowledgement. The winter of 1924 in Granite Creek was comparatively mild but persistently dry. The soil on Clearview Ridge, while insulated beneath Harrow's sod-covered cabin, experienced the cyclic expansion and contraction typical of high-altitude clay-loam mixtures. Harrow meticulously recorded these micro-environmental changes, noting variations in internal humidity, frost penetration, and minor soil shifts along the cabin's earthen walls. To him, each measurement was a small confirmation of the principles he had followed: thermal mass, insulation through earth, and careful ventilation. Yet despite these observations, few outside his immediate circle of curiosity-driven correspondence understood the broader implications. During late February, local authorities reported increased wildfire risk due to early vegetation growth combined with residual dry matter from the previous year's fire. Rangers issued bulletins warning of heightened vigilance and recommending proactive clearing of brush. In the context of these warnings, many residents began modifying conventional fire prevention measures, widening fire breaks, reinforcing chimneys, and hauling water barrels closer to homes. However, these efforts were largely reactive, predicated on conventional logic rather than systematic study. Harrow, in contrast, observed that his cabin's performance during the previous fire provided real-world data on protective design, and he began drafting a series of diagrams and notes intended for wider dissemination. Harrow's efforts were not without practical challenges. On February 17th, a sudden gust of wind from the northwest dislodged a section of the sod roof, exposing a small portion of the timber beneath. Though the damage was minor, it offered an opportunity for empirical observation. Harrow recorded soil density, root-binding integrity, and moisture content, and made repairs using techniques designed to increase adhesion of sod layers. The incident, while small, emphasized the need for maintenance in earth-sheltered designs, a nuance often overlooked by critics who assumed permanence without consideration for material behavior under environmental stress. Meanwhile, social dynamics within Granite Creek continued to evolve. Some residents, previously vocal in their ridicule, began to ask subtle questions. Mr. Tom Weller, the local logger, approached Harrow one afternoon to inquire about soil compaction methods. "I never thought of embedding a cabin like that," Weller admitted. "Not that I'm switching, mind you, but I'd like to understand how you kept it from settling." Such interactions were tentative, marked by curiosity that bordered on respect, though full endorsement remained absent. Harrow, as usual, provided methodical explanations, focusing on soil mechanics, timber reinforcement, and ventilation principles rather than persuading others with rhetoric or spectacle. By early March, reports of wildfires in neighboring counties had emerged, with several fires consuming entire settlements in less than 24 hours. These accounts circulated in Granite Creek, intensifying local awareness of environmental risk. Conversations in the general store and along roads frequently included mentions of Harrow's Mound and that cabin on the ridge, though interpretations varied. Some townspeople attributed its survival to luck. Others, with greater technical curiosity, considered the possibility that the design principles themselves were protective. These discussions were informal, fragmented, and largely speculative, leaving Harrow in a position of quiet documentation rather than public advocacy. In mid-March, an unusually warm spell prompted early budding of shrubs and grasses across the ridge. Harrow observed that the increased vegetation did not affect the cabin's stability or interior climate. His notes emphasized the effectiveness of the sod roof in moderating temperature fluctuations and maintaining soil cohesion. Even as the surrounding landscape experienced accelerated growth, small rodents and birds, initially wary, occasionally traversed the roof and surrounding areas, yet the integrity of the structure remained unimpaired. Such incremental observations added layers of evidence to the empirical record he was compiling. Socially, the cabin's reputation began to crystallize in nuanced ways. Children increasingly treated it as a curiosity to be approached with caution and admiration, mimicking their parents' restrained acknowledgement of its uniqueness. Adults, while largely still skeptical, began to respect the rigor with which Harrow recorded environmental effects, repair techniques, and material behaviors. Occasionally, a visitor from outside Granite Creek, a traveling surveyor or itinerant carpenter, would inquire about the structure, asking detailed questions about construction methods. These interactions reinforced the notion that, while mainstream adoption was slow, awareness of unconventional design was spreading through technical networks, albeit quietly and selectively. April brought intermittent rains, testing the drainage and waterproofing of the cabin. Harrow had anticipated these conditions, incorporating subtle gradients in the earthen roof and perimeter drainage ditches to channel water away from timber framing. Observations confirmed that the interior remained dry while external soil erosion was minimal. His measurements of water infiltration and soil density were precise. Rainfall of 1.8 inches over 24 hours resulted in negligible seepage and maintained roof integrity. This careful recording of post-rain conditions allowed him to compare performance with nearby conventional cabins, many of which experienced minor flooding, rotting of timber at base levels, and accelerated decomposition of wooden shingles. Harrow's success, however, continued to exist in tension with local skepticism. While tangible evidence accumulated, it did so incrementally without the dramatic narrative-defining events that could force public acknowledgement. Town meetings did not recognize the cabin as a model for fire-resistant or climate-adapted design, and formal authorities constrained by prevailing conventions and limited resources largely ignored the structure. At the same time, whispers persisted among informed residents. Could Harrow's methods represent a paradigm shift for high-risk landscapes, or was this an isolated case whose success hinged on unique circumstances of slope, soil, and construction quality? By the end of April, the ridge's vegetation had fully recovered from the winter dormancy, and the region entered a period of calm before the more severe heat of summer. The cabin stood as it had for months, tested by fire, wind, frost, and rain, yet continuing to function without major incident. The contrast with conventional structures rebuilt after the previous wildfire was evident, though rarely discussed openly, leaving an implicit tension between empirical observation and social consensus. Harrow, for his part, remained methodical and patient. He continued refining his journal, sketching detailed cross-sections of timber reinforcements, roof composition, and soil layering techniques. His work emphasized repeatable principles rather than one-off results, though the broader acceptance of these principles was still deferred. The cabin, quiet and unobtrusive, served as a living laboratory, a controlled environment in which data accumulated incrementally, awaiting conditions that might further test its resilience. As May approached, the first hints of the next wildfire season loomed on the horizon. Granite Creek residents remained vigilant, many still skeptical of Harrow's approach, yet unable to ignore the empirical evidence his dwelling presented. The half-buried cabin, quietly enduring, continued to provoke reflection, debate, and subtle reconsideration of established assumptions. The community, poised between tradition and curiosity, had yet to reach consensus, and the true trial of Harrow's unconventional design remained a question deferred by time, circumstance, and human caution. The stage was now set for a more dramatic confrontation between conventional methods and innovative design, but the outcome remained uncertain. Harrow, methodical and patient, continued his quiet observations, cataloging every minor interaction between earth, timber, and environmental forces. Outside, the ridge itself seemed to watch, silent and indifferent, as if anticipating the next challenge that would finally test whether theory, preparation, and unconventional foresight could withstand the trials that nature was certain to impose. By early June of 1924, Granite Creek and the surrounding highlands had entered the peak of their wildfire season. The region had experienced a notably dry spring with rainfall well below historical averages. The dense underbrush, young saplings, and accumulated deadfall from previous seasons had created conditions that local authorities classified as extremely hazardous. Fire watch patrols were intensified, and townspeople kept constant vigilance, knowing that a single ember could trigger disaster. Harrow's cabin, perched partially underground on Clearview Ridge, had become both a point of quiet fascination and subtle apprehension. While no official authority had recognized its design, the growing frequency of fires in neighboring regions prompted some residents to consider the potential protective merits of earth-sheltered structures. Nevertheless, traditionalist sentiment remained strong. Most families continued to invest in conventional log cabins, fire breaks, and chimney guards, guided by methods passed down through generations. On June 12th, a small wildfire ignited along the eastern flank of the ridge, likely caused by lightning striking a cluster of dead pine. Within hours, it had begun to climb, fed by dry brush and strong southwestern winds. Granite Creek residents mobilized rapidly, forming bucket brigades, clearing flammable debris and moving livestock to lower ground. The fire, though initially minor, spread with surprising speed, engulfing areas previously considered safe due to topography or sparse vegetation. Observers from the town noted the uncanny contrast between the advancing flames and Harrow's cabin. As embers leapt across the ridge, the half-buried structure remained intact, the sod roof smoldering only superficially in isolated patches. Children pointed from a safe distance, noting that while conventional cabins showed visible signs of scorching, Harrow's dwelling seemed impervious, its shape and earth covering providing a natural barrier. Adults murmured among themselves, some still reluctant to attribute significance to the observation, while others began to question long-held assumptions about construction, fire behavior, and environmental adaptation. Inside the cabin, Harrow maintained his disciplined routine. He monitored internal temperature, soil moisture, and airflow, noting that the thermal inertia of the earth surrounding the structure prevented rapid temperature spikes. The roof's sod layer, reinforced with a mixture of clay and native grass, absorbed embers without combustion, while ventilation shafts allowed smoke and heat to escape in controlled channels. Each observation was recorded with precision, cataloged by time and environmental conditions, forming a growing body of data that documented the interplay between structure, soil, and fire. Despite these successes, skepticism remained a social barrier. A few neighbors approached cautiously, voicing doubts. Perhaps the fire had merely bypassed the cabin, they suggested. Perhaps luck had spared it once again. Even Mr. Tom Weller, who had expressed mild curiosity earlier, admitted privately that he had considered testing earth-sheltered construction on his own land, though he hesitated to invest time and resources without further evidence. This hesitation underscored a persistent theme. Empirical success alone was insufficient to shift entrenched practices, particularly in a community where tradition governed perception as strongly as observation governed reality. By the evening of June 12th, the fire had crested the ridge, its intensity peaking as the wind gusted at 20 miles per hour. Conventional cabins showed varying degrees of damage. Some were lightly scorched, others suffered partial roof collapse, and a few had to be abandoned entirely. Harrow's cabin, however, remained structurally sound, providing a controlled, insulated interior that mitigated heat exposure and smoke infiltration. The surrounding earth, compacted and reinforced, functioned as both insulation and a fire barrier, confirming the principles Harrow had applied. Soil mass, slope orientation, and careful material selection combined to produce resilience. News of the cabin's endurance spread quietly through the valley. Traders, passing surveyors, and a few townspeople carried accounts of the unusual structure, describing it as a mound that outlasted fire. While the language remained tentative and often anecdotal, it signaled a subtle shift. Observation, however imperfect, was beginning to challenge long-standing assumptions about building practices in wildfire-prone regions. Harrow, consistent with his character, continued documentation without fanfare. Each entry in his journal included precise measurements, environmental conditions, and comparative notes on surrounding conventional structures. He refrained from speculation or advocacy, allowing the evidence to speak through meticulous recording. This disciplined approach would later prove essential in convincing technical authorities of the validity of his methods. Though at this stage, formal recognition remained absent. By June 14th, the fire had largely burned itself out, leaving a scarred landscape and a community grappling with losses. Residents began returning to salvage possessions and rebuild homes, acutely aware of the vulnerability exposed by the fire. In contrast, Harrow's cabin remained intact, a silent demonstration of the efficacy of unconventional design. Its endurance had not yet produced widespread adoption of earth-sheltered construction, but it had planted seeds of reconsideration in the minds of those who observed its resilience firsthand. The fire's aftermath highlighted broader implications for the region. Soil erosion on burned slopes, vulnerability of timber structures, and the unpredictability of ember showers became central topics in informal community discussions. Harrow's cabin, though small and modest in appearance, represented a tangible counterpoint to conventional assumptions. Its existence provoked both curiosity and discomfort. It demonstrated an alternative approach that worked, yet it challenged deeply held norms about building practices, resource allocation, and human adaptation to environmental hazards. By the end of June, Granite Creek had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the fire season had left a lasting impression. Harrow's half-buried cabin stood unscathed, increasingly viewed as an anomaly, yet one that invited cautious study. Children played nearby with a mixture of fear and fascination. Adults observed with guarded interest, and Harrow continued his systematic collection of data. The stage was set for more deliberate examination of earth-sheltered design, yet uncertainty lingered. Would this method prove replicable under different conditions, or was it uniquely suited to the specific slope, soil, and climate of Clearview Ridge? For now, the community existed in a state of ambivalence. Harrow had demonstrated resilience where conventional methods had failed, yet the broader implications of his design remained untested in other contexts. Skepticism persisted, tempered by undeniable empirical evidence, and the half-buried cabin continued to function as both a quiet laboratory and a symbol of unconventional foresight. The coming months promised further observation, potential replication, and inevitably the gradual reconciliation between tradition and innovation. By mid-July 1924, the dry season in Granite Creek had intensified. Temperatures frequently surpassed 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, and nights offered little reprieve from the heat. The combination of prolonged dryness, accumulated underbrush, and high winds created conditions increasingly favorable to wildfires. Local authorities issued repeated advisories, urging residents to maintain fire breaks and keep water reserves close at hand. In this heightened state of alert, the contrast between conventional and unconventional structures became more pronounced. Harrow's cabin, with its partially subterranean design, demonstrated a notable thermal advantage. Measurements recorded daily revealed interior temperatures fluctuating within a narrow band of 70 to 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite external temperatures reaching extremes, the sodden earth surrounding the cabin absorbed and dissipated heat, while careful ventilation ensured air exchange without introducing embers. Harrow meticulously documented each environmental parameter: wind speed, relative humidity, soil temperature at multiple depths, and ember deposition on the roof, maintaining a level of empirical rigor unmatched by his neighbors. The community, meanwhile, faced growing anxiety. Reports from neighboring regions indicated destructive fires consuming timbered settlements and small towns. Families in Granite Creek convened informal councils to discuss preparedness, but these meetings, primarily reinforced conventional wisdom: wider fire breaks, higher water reserves, and reliance on traditional timber construction methods. While Harrow's cabin had survived previous incidents, few participants advocated for replicating its design, constrained by cost, labor, and skepticism regarding unconventional methods. On July 15th, a sudden lightning strike ignited a wildfire on the eastern slope of Clearview Ridge. This fire, though initially small, quickly escalated due to gusting winds and the abundance of dry pine needles. Conventional cabins were at immediate risk, and townspeople scrambled to implement emergency measures. Observers noted that while flames consumed exposed timber structures, Harrow's cabin withstood the approach of the fire with minimal surface scorching. Its earthen roof absorbed ember impacts, and the surrounding soil acted as a natural barrier, preventing lateral flame propagation. Inside the cabin, Harrow conducted systematic observations. He monitored the differential between exterior and interior temperatures, noting a delay of nearly 45 minutes before ambient heat affected the interior. Smoke penetration was negligible thanks to the design of narrow ventilation shafts and elevated flue exits. Harrow recorded ember deposition, noting minor charring on the roof surface that posed no structural threat. Each observation reinforced the principles he had long documented: thermal mass, earth insulation, slope orientation, and ventilation collectively contributed to resilience against wildfire conditions. Among neighbors, curiosity began to manifest more openly, though hesitation persisted. Mr. Weller and a few others cautiously approached the cabin during the fire, observing its resistance. Whispered conversations acknowledged the discrepancy between conventional structures and Harrow's dwelling. "It shouldn't have held," one remarked quietly. "But there it is, barely touched." Others speculated about environmental luck, suggesting that the fire's trajectory may have spared the structure. Nonetheless, empirical evidence was accumulating. Repeated tests under real-world fire conditions increasingly challenged prior assumptions. By the evening of July 15th, the wildfire had largely burned itself out along the ridge, leaving charred vegetation but sparing Harrow's cabin. Conventional homes suffered varying degrees of damage, from partial roof collapse to full structural loss. Townspeople salvaged what remained, their perspectives subtly shifting as they reconciled observation with entrenched beliefs. The half-buried cabin became a point of cautious discussion. While some continued to dismiss it as anomalous, Others quietly recognized that its design offered demonstrable protection. Harrow, consistent with his methodical nature, refrained from public advocacy. He focused on precise documentation, detailing ember impacts, soil stability, thermal gradients, and roof integrity. He cross-referenced current data with observations from the previous wildfire in October, noting consistencies and minor deviations. His journal became an increasingly robust record of empirical evidence, emphasizing replicable principles rather than anecdotal triumph. The events of mid-July marked a turning point in subtle social perception. Though formal recognition remained absent, informed observers, engineers, surveyors, and cautious townspeople began to acknowledge that Harrow's methods merited further study. The idea that earth-sheltered structures could provide resilience against wildfire was no longer purely speculative. Yet widespread adoption remained unlikely due to labor intensity, material sourcing, and entrenched social conventions favoring traditional timber construction. As July drew to a close, Harrow extended his observations to include post-fire soil analysis. He noted changes in soil compaction, minor erosion on the slope, and regrowth of ground cover. The earthen insulation of the cabin remained intact, demonstrating durability under both thermal and environmental stress. His records included precise measurements of soil moisture, root reinforcement, and the impact of repeated ember exposure, forming a comprehensive data set that documented the intersection of design, materials, and environmental interaction. By the end of the month, Granite Creek had experienced its most severe wildfire tests to date, and the contrast between conventional and unconventional construction had become undeniable. Harrow's half-buried cabin, still unadorned and modest in appearance, stood as a quiet testament to the efficacy of empirically grounded design. While skepticism persisted among parts of the community, repeated observation had begun to erode outright dismissal. The stage was set for broader consideration of earth-sheltered construction principles. Though social inertia and practical constraints would delay widespread experimentation, Harrow, ever diligent, continued his methodical recording, fully aware that acceptance of his principles required time, patience, and undeniable evidence. The cabin had proven its resilience through repeated wildfire events. Yet the challenge remained, convincing a community conditioned by tradition that unconventional design could offer both protection and longevity. Outside, Clearview Ridge, scorched yet enduring, bore witness to this quiet contest between empirical evidence and social skepticism, a tension that would define the next chapter of Harrow's work and the gradual evolution of construction practices in wildfire-prone regions. August of 1924 arrived with the characteristic dry heat of the Granite Creek Highlands. The valley floor shimmered under the sun, while Clearview Ridge, though scarred from previous fires, exhibited early signs of regrowth. Small shrubs and young saplings pushed through the blackened soil, a testament to the resilience of nature, yet their presence heightened concerns for the coming fire season. Residents remained vigilant, aware that even minor ignition could escalate quickly under prevailing conditions. Harrow's cabin, as ever, functioned as a quiet observatory amid this environment. The partially subterranean design allowed it to maintain a remarkably stable interior climate, despite external heat spikes reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit on several days. Harrow measured thermal gradients within the earthen walls and roof, confirming that the soil mass continued to buffer temperature fluctuations effectively. He noted minor micro-cracks in the clay reinforcement but documented them as negligible regarding structural integrity. Maintenance routines, including sod reinforcement and flue inspections, ensured that the cabin remained operational without incident. The community's awareness of the cabin's durability had grown subtly but perceptibly. Travelers returning from neighboring counties having witnessed or heard of recent wildfires occasionally inquired about the unusual structure on Clearview Ridge. Some townspeople who had observed its survival firsthand began voicing cautious opinions during informal gatherings. "It's remarkable how it held," one would remark, often followed by a hesitant, "I suppose it must be something about the way it's built." Such statements reflected a shift from outright dismissal to tentative consideration, though formal endorsement or adoption remained limited. In mid-August, a second wildfire ignited on the western flank of the ridge, this time triggered by a dry lightning strike during a brief but intense thunderstorm. Conventional structures were immediately at risk, and residents scrambled to implement fire suppression measures. Harrow's cabin again faced the advancing flames. From inside, he monitored external conditions with meticulous attention. Wind speed at 18 miles per hour, ember deposition, relative humidity, and soil temperature at multiple depths. The cabin's interior remained stable, its earthen walls absorbing radiant heat, and its sod roof shielding the timber frame from ignition. Observers from the town gathering at a safe distance noted the striking difference. Conventional log cabins displayed scorched shingles, partial roof collapse, and in some cases interior smoke infiltration. Harrow's dwelling, by contrast, exhibited only minor surface charring on the sod roof. Children who had previously approached the cabin with cautious curiosity now watched with fascination, while adults engaged in hushed discussions acknowledging the cabin's effectiveness even if reluctant to accept its broader implications. This fire presented an opportunity for empirical comparison that Harrow seized upon. He measured ember accumulation on neighboring structures and compared thermal absorption rates between conventional timber and the earth-sheltered cabin. His documentation demonstrated a clear pattern. The combination of earth insulation, slope placement, and sod reinforcement consistently mitigated heat exposure and prevented structural compromise. These observations, meticulously recorded in daily journal entries, provided increasingly compelling evidence of the cabin's functional superiority in wildfire conditions. Despite this growing body of evidence, skepticism persisted. Some residents continued to attribute the cabin's resilience to fortuitous circumstances, suggesting that fire trajectory or wind direction had spared it once again. Others proposed more imaginative explanations, such as underground water sources or secretive chemical treatments, though Harrow had disclosed all construction methods in his correspondence with regional engineers. The tension between empirical observation and social perception remained unresolved, reflecting the broader challenge faced by innovators whose methods diverged from convention. In late August, Harrow expanded his observations to include ecological interactions surrounding the cabin. The regrowth of vegetation, soil stabilization, and minor wildlife activity were carefully noted. Root systems contributed to soil cohesion, preventing erosion that might otherwise compromise the earthen roof. Small mammals avoided burrowing beneath the structure, likely deterred by soil compaction and human presence, which in turn reduced the risk of subterranean damage. These subtleties, while minor individually, collectively demonstrated the resilience of an integrated design, structural, environmental, and ecological. By the end of the month, the community had experienced repeated exposure to wildfire risk, with Harrow's cabin consistently outperforming conventional structures. Quiet acknowledgement began to emerge among those with technical curiosity. Surveyors, engineers, and attentive townspeople started to recognize that the observed resilience was not merely accidental. Yet formal recognition remained absent, and widespread adoption of earth-sheltered construction was still constrained by labor, materials, and prevailing cultural assumptions. Harrow himself remained methodical, never seeking accolades. Each journal entry was precise, including measurements of soil density, ember impact frequency, interior thermal consistency, and vegetation effects. Cross-references to previous wildfire events allowed longitudinal analysis, reinforcing the principle that the cabin's performance was repeatable under varying conditions. His work began to form the basis for an empirical framework that could, in time, inform broader architectural practice in fire-prone regions. As August drew to a close, Granite Creek stood at a point of quiet transition. The valley and ridge bore the scars of repeated fire exposure. Conventional methods had shown their vulnerabilities, and Harrow's earth-sheltered cabin remained a living demonstration of resilience. Yet uncertainty lingered. Would replication of these principles succeed in different topographies and climates? Could the social and economic constraints of the region allow widespread adoption? The answers were not yet clear, leaving the community in a state of cautious observation and reflection. Thus, Clearview Ridge remained a silent witness. Harrow's cabin, modest and unadorned, continued to serve as a laboratory, its endurance a persistent question to tradition, yet a quietly accumulating body of evidence for those willing to observe carefully. The next trials, whether environmental, social, or technical, would determine whether the unconventional design could transition from anomaly to acknowledged model. For now, it stood, resilient yet uncelebrated, at the intersection of nature, innovation, and human skepticism. September 1924 brought a subtle shift in the Granite Creek climate. While temperatures were beginning to moderate, early seasonal winds stirred dry leaf litter across the ridge, and the risk of wildfire remained a constant concern. Local forecasters warned that even a brief lapse in vigilance could trigger rapid and destructive fire events. For most residents, the practical implications were clear. Continued attention to conventional fire mitigation was essential. Yet Harrow's cabin quietly continued to challenge the assumptions underpinning those conventional strategies. Harrow, as always, maintained meticulous observation. He recorded interior and exterior temperatures, humidity levels, and the subtle variations in soil moisture content as seasonal rains began. The earthen mass of the cabin moderated internal conditions with remarkable consistency, despite external fluctuations. He noted that thermal inertia was most pronounced in the lower, partially subterranean chambers where soil depth exceeded 4 feet. Temperatures there remained stable even when ambient heat and wind gusts varied dramatically. Harrow's journal entries detailed these observations with methodical precision, forming an increasingly robust empirical record. During this period, a local construction engineer, Mr. Samuel Hargrove, visited Clearview Ridge after hearing of the cabin's repeated resilience. Hargrove was pragmatic and cautious by nature, accustomed to conventional timber and masonry construction. Yet he approached Harrow's dwelling with an evident mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "It seems durable," he noted after inspecting the sod roof and earthen walls. "But is it scalable? Would this work across the valley, or is it unique to this ridge?" Harrow responded with precise explanations. The principles of earth insulation, soil compaction, ventilation, and slope orientation were applicable in varied contexts, though adaptation would require careful analysis of local soil composition, rainfall patterns, and wildfire risk. The visit, though brief, had subtle social effects. Hargrove shared his impressions with a few contacts in nearby towns, describing the cabin as a methodical experiment with repeatable results. These cautious endorsements began to circulate, quietly eroding the skepticism of technically minded observers. In Granite Creek itself, a few residents who had previously dismissed the cabin outright began discussing its merits more openly, though the broader population remained committed to conventional construction practices. On September 18th, a small, rapidly advancing fire ignited on the southern ridge. The blaze was fueled by accumulated dry brush and strong winds, presenting conditions similar to previous wildfire events. Conventional homes, some rebuilt after earlier fires, were immediately threatened. Townspeople mobilized as before, forming bucket brigades and clearing flammable debris. Harrow's cabin again faced the approaching fire, offering an opportunity to observe the principles he had documented over the past year. Inside the cabin, Harrow monitored conditions meticulously. Ember impacts on the sod roof were minor, absorbed without ignition. Ventilation shafts allowed smoke and minimal heat to escape, preventing accumulation of hazardous conditions. Thermal gradients between interior and exterior remained favorable, with interior temperatures rising only slightly under intense external heat. These observations reinforced the effectiveness of soil mass and insulation, validating conclusions drawn from earlier events in October 1923 and July 1924. Outside, observers noted the striking contrast. Conventional cabins displayed varying degrees of damage, from surface charring to partial roof collapse, while Harrow's dwelling remained intact. Whispered discussions among townspeople reflected a growing awareness. The repeated survival of the earth-sheltered cabin could no longer be attributed solely to chance. Even those who remained skeptical acknowledged that empirical evidence demanded consideration, though many still hesitated to endorse full-scale replication. Harrow, consistent in approach, continued documenting every detail. Soil compaction, ember deposition, roof integrity, and minor environmental interactions were recorded with precision. He cross-referenced data with previous fires, noting consistency in outcomes and minor variances attributable to wind direction, fire intensity, and vegetation density. This longitudinal record emphasized that the design was not a singular success but a repeatable method, capable of mitigating wildfire risk when applied carefully. By the end of September, a quiet transformation was underway in local perception. Technically minded observers, surveyors, engineers, and a small contingent of curious townspeople began acknowledging the cabin as a credible model. Children and casual observers treated it with fascination and respect, while adults debated the practicalities of replication. Nevertheless, the broader community remained divided. The labor and resources required for earth-sheltered construction, combined with cultural adherence to conventional methods, limited immediate adoption. Harrow's role, as ever, remained observational and empirical rather than prescriptive. The cabin functioned as a living laboratory, quietly accumulating data through repeated environmental challenges. Each wildfire, windstorm, and seasonal variation provided further validation of the principles he had applied: thermal mass, soil insulation, slope placement, and controlled ventilation. Yet social recognition, formal acknowledgement, and widespread application were still matters for the future. Thus, September closed with Granite Creek poised between experience and tradition. Harrow's cabin, repeatedly tested and consistently resilient, stood uncelebrated yet undeniable in its effectiveness. The community faced the subtle realization that established methods had limitations, and that innovation, though initially met with skepticism, could offer measurable benefits. The next phase, replication, broader acknowledgement, and potential integration into conventional practice, remained uncertain, awaiting the convergence of evidence, opportunity, and social will. Clearview Ridge, scarred but enduring, bore silent witness to this unfolding interplay of human ingenuity, environmental challenge, and the slow evolution of perception. Harrow's cabin remained at the center, a quiet testament to methodical preparation and unconventional foresight, awaiting conditions that might finally reconcile skepticism with recognition. By October 1924, Granite Creek experienced its first substantial seasonal rains. After nearly a year of meticulous observation, Harrow's cabin had been tested repeatedly against both fire and drought, yet the onset of sustained precipitation introduced a new variable: prolonged water exposure. While much of the community anticipated challenges with soil saturation, roof leaks, and potential structural instability, Harrow's earth-sheltered design offered an opportunity to examine resilience under a different set of environmental stresses. Harrow began by documenting soil moisture at multiple depths, particularly focusing on the earthen roof and the walls of the subterranean chambers. He noted that the sod layer, reinforced with clay and rooted grass, absorbed rainfall gradually, preventing runoff and maintaining soil cohesion. Water percolated slowly through the upper layers, while drainage trenches surrounding the cabin channeled excess moisture away from timber framing. These measures, deliberately designed during construction, allowed the structure to withstand weeks of intermittent rain without internal flooding or roof collapse. A contrast to conventional cabins in the valley, many of which exhibited water damage and wood rot. The community's attention, however, remained largely on more immediate concerns: repairing conventional cabins damaged in previous fires, maintaining livestock, and preparing for the coming winter. Yet some residents, particularly those with a technical inclination, began taking a closer interest in Harrow's systematic documentation. Mr. Weller, the local logger, returned to Clearview Ridge with a notebook in hand. "I admit," he said cautiously, "I wanted to see whether the cabin really holds under wet conditions. Dry tests are one thing, but rain is another." Harrow welcomed the observation, demonstrating drainage systems, soil compaction techniques, and roof layering, while Weller recorded measurements meticulously. By mid-October, rainstorms intensified, and low-lying areas in Granite Creek experienced minor flooding. Conventional structures suffered. Sagging roofs, water infiltration, and partial wall collapse were common, prompting urgent repairs. Harrow's cabin, in contrast, continued to perform as designed. Internal temperatures remained stable. Soil cohesion prevented erosion of the roof, and timber framing remained dry. Harrow documented each aspect of performance, including the behavior of minor surface cracks, seepage points, and post-storm soil compaction changes. The data reinforced the principle that earth-sheltered structures offered protection not only against fire but also against environmental extremes less anticipated by the broader community. News of the cabin's performance began to circulate more broadly, though still informally. Passing surveyors, traveling engineers, and visiting tradesmen recorded observations and shared them cautiously in other towns. Discussions in Granite Creek gradually shifted from speculation to tentative acknowledgement of Harrow's methods. The cabin was no longer merely an oddity. It was becoming a recognized case study in environmental resilience, though full acceptance and replication remained limited by labor and material requirements, as well as ingrained construction traditions. On October 21st, an unseasonable windstorm swept through the valley, combining heavy rain with gusts exceeding 25 miles per hour. Conventional cabins with exposed roofs suffered immediate damage. Shingles lifted, chimneys toppled, and interiors were compromised. Harrow's dwelling, however, remained structurally sound. The earthen roof absorbed wind and water, and the slope of the ridge aided in diverting rainfall efficiently. Harrow conducted careful measurements of wind pressure, water runoff, and soil displacement, noting only minor adjustments needed for roof sod reinforcement. The cabin's performance during this windstorm prompted closer attention from technically minded residents. Mr. Hargrove, the visiting engineer, recorded observations and cross-referenced them with Harrow's prior data on wildfire resilience. Together, they began to consider the potential for replicating these design principles in other high-risk areas. Yet practical constraints, including labor-intensive construction, material availability, and community resistance to unconventional methods, limited immediate application beyond the ridge. By the end of October, the pattern was unmistakable. Harrow's cabin had withstood multiple wildfires, drought, conditions, and now heavy seasonal rains, demonstrating resilience across a range of environmental challenges. Yet broader recognition remained cautious. While technically informed observers began to accept the principles, social and economic factors delayed widespread adoption. The broader community continued to view the structure with a mixture of admiration, skepticism, and caution. Harrow, consistent in his approach, continued meticulous documentation. His journal now contained longitudinal data spanning fire, drought, wind, and precipitation, each entry linked to specific measurements and environmental conditions. The empirical record offered compelling evidence of a repeatable method, yet he remained circumspect in presentation, avoiding speculation or advocacy. The cabin was not a monument to personal ingenuity, but a disciplined experiment in the application of environmental principles, quietly awaiting conditions that might finally prompt broader acknowledgement. As October drew to a close, Granite Creek faced a subtle tension. Conventional structures remained vulnerable. Fires had demonstrated the limitations of traditional methods, and Harrow's cabin quietly performed without incident. The community stood at a threshold. Empirical evidence was accumulating. Technical observers were increasingly convinced, but social inertia, resource limitations, and entrenched practices continued to delay broader adoption. The half-buried cabin remained a symbol of both innovation and patience, awaiting the convergence of necessity, opportunity, and recognition that might ultimately validate the unconventional design. November 1924 introduced the first serious cold snaps of the season in Granite Creek. Nights dropped below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and frost formed consistently across open fields. While the valley floor experienced intermittent snow, the higher elevations of Clearview Ridge were coated with light accumulations, testing not only thermal insulation but also the structural capacity of roofs under added weight. For most residents, this was a period of heightened concern, as conventional cabins, often hastily rebuilt after wildfire damage, were poorly equipped to withstand frost heaving and snow load. Harrow's earth-sheltered cabin, however, provided a controlled environment for systematic observation. Harrow began monitoring internal temperatures and humidity levels with even greater frequency. The partially subterranean design maintained interior conditions between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, despite sub-zero external readings during nighttime hours. The earthen roof, insulated by compacted clay and rooted sod, resisted frost penetration and prevented ice formation directly atop the timber structure. Harrow recorded temperature differentials at multiple depths of the soil layer, noting how thermal inertia delayed cooling and moderated internal climate fluctuations. He also observed the condensation behavior on timber surfaces and interior air quality, taking detailed notes that highlighted both the cabin's resilience and the subtle physiological comfort afforded to occupants. The broader community had now accumulated over a year of observation, and while outright admiration remained limited, curiosity and cautious respect had increased. Mr. Weller and a handful of technically inclined residents continued to consult Harrow informally, discussing aspects of soil compaction, drainage, and roof reinforcement. Their questions were practical rather than theoretical, often focusing on the feasibility of replicating the design for winter resilience. Harrow responded with methodical explanations, providing sketches and calculations rather than assertions of superiority. On November 12th, a heavy snowfall of approximately 6 inches occurred over Clearview Ridge. Conventional cabins showed immediate signs of stress. Roof shingles sagged under the weight, some structures experienced minor collapse, and frozen water seeped into timber framing. Harrow's cabin, however, absorbed the load without structural compromise. The sodden soil layers distributed weight evenly across the roof frame, while the compacted earthen walls resisted frost heaving and soil displacement. Harrow meticulously recorded measurements of snow weight, soil compression, and internal air temperature. noting that the combination of earth insulation and careful roof engineering prevented thermal loss and structural damage. Observers from the valley occasionally visited during snow events. While most residents maintained safe distances, several technically minded individuals, including Mr. Hargrove, returned to compare conventional structures with Harrow's cabin. They recorded the persistence of internal warmth, minimal roof deformation, and the integrity of ventilation systems. Discussions shifted from theoretical curiosity to practical implications. If this design could withstand wildfire, drought, wind, and now snow, it represented a systematic and repeatable approach to environmental resilience. Despite accumulating evidence, skepticism persisted among the broader population. Many villagers remained committed to traditional timber cabins, citing labor costs, familiarity, and the perceived difficulty of sourcing suitable sod and clay for construction. Even as Harrow's cabin repeatedly demonstrated superior performance under multiple environmental stressors, social inertia limited the immediate spread of the methods he employed. Conversations were increasingly nuanced, however, acknowledging that while replication posed challenges, the underlying principles had been convincingly demonstrated. By late November, Granite Creek faced intermittent snowstorms interspersed with brief thaws. Harrow continued his careful monitoring, observing minor soil settling, slight roof adjustments under freeze-thaw cycles, and vegetation responses on the sod roof. He documented these observations in precise detail, comparing data with prior months' measurements of fire and rain exposure. Each entry reinforced the cabin's repeatable resilience, while also noting areas for refinement, such as improved drainage around the perimeter and slight adjustments to soil compaction techniques to further mitigate frost heaving. The repeated successes had begun to shift attitudes subtly. Technically informed residents increasingly referred to the cabin in discussions about construction for high-risk conditions, often using measured language. "It appears effective," or "the principles are sound, though labor-intensive." The social narrative, while far from complete endorsement, was gradually recognizing the value of evidence-based innovation. Harrow, as always, maintained focus on empirical data rather than persuasion, allowing observation and replication to form the basis of credibility. As November drew to a close, the ridge stood partially snow-covered, with surrounding conventional structures bearing the marks of seasonal stress. Harrow's cabin remained intact, quietly validating the principles of earth insulation, sod reinforcement, slope orientation, and ventilation under frost and snow load. The stage was set for continued observation through winter, with the potential to demonstrate year-round resilience against environmental extremes. Clearview Ridge, enduring yet scarred from fire, rain, and frost, remained a silent witness. Harrow's half-buried cabin had now proven its efficacy across multiple environmental challenges, yet formal acknowledgement and widespread adoption remained deferred. The next months promised further testing, subtle social shifts, and perhaps gradual recognition by authorities and neighbors alike, though uncertainty continued to define the community's perception of unconventional design. December 1924 brought harsher conditions to Granite Creek. The ridge was now blanketed in snow, with temperatures frequently dipping below 25 degrees Fahrenheit at night, while the valley floor experienced intermittent frost. Clearview Ridge bore the brunt of early winter storms, testing both the structural and thermal resilience of local dwellings. Conventional cabins rebuilt after prior wildfires often suffered minor roof collapses or internal drafts, highlighting vulnerabilities in traditional timber construction. Harrow's cabin, however, continued to function as intended. Harrow meticulously measured interior temperature, humidity, and airflow, observing that the subterranean chambers maintained a remarkably stable environment, even under sustained sub-zero conditions. The earthen roof, reinforced with clay and sod, absorbed snow load effectively, distributing weight evenly across the timber frame. Slight adjustments were made to peripheral drainage channels to ensure that melting snow did not compromise the soil foundation. Each observation was documented with exact measurements, allowing Harrow to refine the empirical model of his design. The repeated successes over the year were beginning to attract attention beyond casual curiosity. Mr. Hargrove, the visiting engineer, returned for a second inspection, bringing detailed notes from his colleagues in neighboring towns. Discussions shifted from simple admiration to practical evaluation. How might these design principles be applied more broadly? Could earth-sheltered construction mitigate the growing awareness of wildfire and seasonal hazards in surrounding regions? The questions were cautiously raised, reflecting a slow shift in technical perception. By mid-December, additional snowfall and sub-freezing nights provided further validation of the cabin's thermal efficiency. Harrow measured thermal gradients through multiple soil depths, noting that heat retention was most effective in chambers located below 4 feet of earth cover. Minor frost heaving at the edges of the roof and walls was recorded, but these deviations were inconsequential to overall structural integrity. Harrow cross-referenced the data with prior observations during wildfires, summer drought, and windstorms, demonstrating the cabin's repeatable resilience across diverse environmental challenges. Conversations within the community reflected an emerging pattern. Technically minded residents were beginning to acknowledge the practical value of earth-sheltered design. Mr. Weller, who had previously expressed cautious curiosity, began to consider experimenting with small-scale versions on his own property. Other neighbors remained hesitant, citing labor intensity, material sourcing, and adherence to conventional building practices. Nevertheless, Harrow's repeated success under diverse environmental conditions had created an undeniable empirical record that was slowly influencing local perception. By late December, the ridge had endured its harshest winter tests yet. Harrow's cabin stood unscathed amidst heavy snow, wind, and frost, providing a clear counterpoint to conventional construction failures. This period marked the first sustained recognition, however informal, that the principles underlying the design were both practical and replicable. Harrow remained methodical, emphasizing documentation and observation, allowing empirical evidence rather than advocacy to guide social perception. The stage was now set for the transition to broader acknowledgement. The combination of repeated environmental testing and cautious social observation had established credibility, though widespread adoption remained constrained by tradition and labor requirements. Harrow's cabin had demonstrated year-round resilience, quietly validating his unconventional design and laying the groundwork for the eventual shift in professional and communal recognition. January 1925 brought deep snow and prolonged cold to Granite Creek, testing the final seasonal extremes for Harrow's cabin. The ridge, blanketed in white, experienced nightly temperatures consistently below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. While conventional cabins struggled with draft, ice accumulation, and minor structural stress, Harrow's half-buried dwelling continued to provide a stable interior environment. Temperatures in the subterranean chambers remained between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a remarkable consistency given the severity of external conditions. Harrow extended his observational rigor, measuring soil moisture beneath the snow load distribution across the sod roof, and thermal conduction through earthen walls. Slight frost heaving at the edges of the roof was noted but posed no structural risk. Ventilation shafts were monitored for airflow, ensuring that condensation did not accumulate in interior timber surfaces. These measurements were meticulously logged, providing a longitudinal record spanning more than a year, encompassing fire, drought, windstorms, rain, and now, winter conditions. The repeated successes of the cabin were beginning to attract wider attention. Mr. Hargrove returned once again, this time accompanied by 2 engineers from the Regional Civil Survey Office. Their goal was to evaluate whether Harrow's methods could be adapted for broader application in fire and snow-prone areas. Observations were detailed and systematic. Soil compaction, insulation thickness, sod root density, and roof slope were all measured and compared against standard construction norms. The engineers noted that the cabin not only resisted fire and snow, but also provided superior thermal efficiency relative to timber-only structures. These technical assessments marked a subtle but significant shift. Harrow's design was no longer merely an anecdotal anomaly. Evidence now suggested that the principles underpinning the cabin, earth insulation, subterranean integration, slope optimization, and controlled ventilation, could be applied more broadly. Hargrove and his colleagues began drafting preliminary recommendations for experimental replication, though they emphasized that labor intensity and material sourcing would remain practical constraints. Within Granite Creek, residents increasingly referred to the cabin in discussions of construction practices. Conversations shifted from speculative curiosity to measured acknowledgement. "It appears the design works," remarked Mr. Weller, "not just for fire but for snow and wind as well." While formal adoption remained limited, the social perception of Harrow's methods had begun to evolve, driven by sustained empirical observation and corroborated by external technical review. By late January, another minor fire ignited in the foothills below Clearview Ridge, offering a final opportunity to test the cabin's fire resilience during winter conditions. Ember deposition, thermal absorption, and smoke infiltration were all measured in detail. Harrow's cabin again demonstrated remarkable resistance, with only minimal surface charring on the sod roof. Conventional structures in the valley experienced varying degrees of damage, reinforcing the contrast between established construction methods and the earth-sheltered approach. This period marked the beginning of what could be described as early professional acknowledgement. Engineers and technically informed residents now discussed the cabin's design with serious consideration. Harrow, maintaining his characteristic objectivity, provided empirical evidence rather than advocacy, allowing the data to speak for itself. This approach lent credibility to his methods and fostered trust among observers who had previously been skeptical. As January drew to a close, Granite Creek faced an unprecedented alignment of environmental tests: deep snow, sub-zero temperatures, and minor wildfire activity. Harrow's cabin had consistently demonstrated resilience, validating the underlying design principles across multiple stressors. The stage was set for the next phase: gradual acceptance, practical experimentation by others, and eventual recognition of the cabin as a viable model for fire and weather-resistant construction. February 1925 arrived with relentless winter storms, combining heavy snowfall with gusty winds that swept down the valley from the surrounding highlands. Granite Creek, though accustomed to seasonal extremes, had yet to face a convergence of environmental stressors on this scale. Conventional cabins, many of which had already endured fire and previous winter damage, were particularly vulnerable. Roofs sagged under accumulated snow, chimneys cracked, and interior drafts intensified as wood shrank and settled under fluctuating temperatures. Harrow's cabin, by contrast, continued to provide stable, secure shelter, offering a living demonstration of the principles he had applied for more than a year. By mid-February, the subtle shift in perception among technically minded residents began to broaden into formal acknowledgement. Mr. Hargrove and his colleagues prepared detailed reports for the Regional Civil Survey Office, documenting Harrow's methods and the cabin's repeated performance across wildfire, drought, windstorm, and snow. Measurements of soil compaction, sod thickness, subterranean depth, and ventilation effectiveness were meticulously tabulated. The conclusion was clear. The cabin offered measurable advantages over conventional timber structures in multiple environmental conditions. representing a replicable model rather than an isolated anomaly. Harrow remained methodical, providing data and demonstrations but refraining from overt advocacy. This approach further enhanced credibility among professional observers, who appreciated the rigor of empirical evidence. Engineers, surveyors, and technically inclined residents began to discuss potential adaptations of Earth-sheltered design in other regions of similar topography and climatic risk. The discussions emphasized practicality. While labor and materials remained constraints, the principles themselves were sound and, in some cases, superior to conventional construction for fire and weather-prone areas. Late February brought another wildfire sparked by an early thaw and dry brush on the western flank of Clearview Ridge. Conventional homes suffered varying degrees of damage. Scorched siding, partial roof collapse, and smoke infiltration were common. Harrow's cabin, however, remained intact, absorbing radiant heat through its earthen walls and roof, while ember deposition caused only minor surface charring. Observers from the valley, including engineers and local officials, recorded measurements and compared the outcomes to surrounding structures. The empirical evidence was irrefutable. The cabin's unconventional design outperformed traditional methods across repeated environmental tests. Social acknowledgement began to shift more noticeably. Local newspapers, previously dismissive of the so-called half-buried cabin, ran cautious accounts of its repeated resilience, emphasizing technical observation over anecdotal praise. Phrases such as empirical performance and environmentally resilient design appeared in print, signaling a subtle but significant change in public discourse. Residents who had previously mocked the structure began to speak more cautiously, often acknowledging its effectiveness without committing to immediate replication. The transition from skepticism to tentative respect was underway. By the end of February, the stage was set for a broader reassessment of conventional building practices in Granite Creek and surrounding counties. Harrow's cabin, repeatedly tested through wildfire, drought, windstorm, rain, and winter snow, had become a credible model of environmental resilience. Formal acknowledgement by engineers and technically informed observers lent legitimacy to the design, while informal social acceptance among curious residents continued to expand gradually. The conventional hierarchy of construction methods, once unchallenged, faced its first real reconsideration. Despite this progress, widespread adoption remained constrained by practical realities. Labor-intensive construction, material sourcing, and entrenched cultural practices continued to limit replication. Yet the shift in authority, the acknowledgement of Harrow's methods by regional engineers and local technical authorities, marked a pivotal turning point. The unconventional cabin was no longer merely tolerated. It was recognized as a functional, replicable solution with tangible advantages. As February drew to a close, Clearview Ridge stood as a quiet testament to methodical observation and empirical evidence. Harrow's half-buried cabin had survived its harshest tests, achieved early professional recognition, and begun to influence the conversation about construction in fire and weather-prone regions. The next stage would see the first deliberate efforts to replicate the design, solidifying the cabin's reputation and setting the foundation for long-term legacy. March 1925 brought the gradual thaw of winter snow across Granite Creek, signaling the onset of early spring and a shift in environmental pressures. As temperatures rose and snowmelt increased soil moisture, the valley began to experience both runoff challenges and the early stages of vegetation growth. For conventional cabins, winter damage and residual moisture continued to pose problems. Sagging roofs, warped timber, and mold infiltration were common. Harrow's earth-sheltered cabin, by contrast, remained structurally sound and functionally stable, offering consistent thermal performance and effective drainage. With winter behind them, technically minded residents and visiting engineers began to implement small-scale replications of Harrow's design principles. Soil compaction techniques, partial subterranean integration, and sod-reinforced roofs were adapted in experimental cottages and storage buildings across the ridge. While labor and material constraints limited immediate large-scale adoption, these early applications demonstrated that Harrow's principles were transferable, capable of providing resilience under both fire and environmental stressors. Harrow continued to act as a careful observer and consultant rather than a prescriptive designer. He offered guidance on soil selection, slope orientation, drainage, and insulation without asserting authority or expecting deference. This approach maintained the credibility of his empirical record, ensuring that replication efforts were based on observation and technique rather than anecdotal claims. Engineers documented every adaptation, tracking performance during spring windstorms, early wildfires in dry brush areas, and periods of intense rainfall. Social acknowledgement had shifted significantly by this time. Locals who had once mocked the half-buried cabin now expressed cautious admiration, sometimes offering assistance or inquiring about practical implementation for their own properties. Discussions in community gatherings and local trade meetings increasingly referenced Harrow's methods, using technical terminology and data points rather than rumor or conjecture. The cabin had transitioned from an object of ridicule to a respected case study in environmental resilience. In mid-March, a controlled burn conducted by local forestry officials provided another opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness of replicated earth-sheltered structures. Fires were contained in predetermined plots, and observers measured heat absorption, ember deposition, and structural integrity. The replicated structures, built according to Harrow's guidelines, withstood the controlled burn with minimal damage, confirming that the principles could be applied successfully beyond the original cabin. Harrow meticulously documented the results, noting minor variances due to soil composition and construction precision, but the overall performance reinforced his conclusions. The process of replication and validation marked the quiet success of the unconventional design. Though widespread adoption across the valley would take years, the empirical evidence and technical experimentation established a foundation for confidence in earth-sheltered construction. Engineers who had once been skeptical were now actively referencing Harrow's methods in discussions of fire-resistant and environmentally adaptive architecture. Local residents, while still cautious about committing resources to full-scale replication, increasingly viewed the approach as both credible and desirable. By late March, the ridge itself had begun to reflect the influence of Harrow's approach. Small, earth-sheltered structures dotted the landscape, each serving as a practical demonstration of the design's resilience. These early implementations, while modest, symbolized a shift in authority and perception. Technical credibility had replaced ridicule, and practical observation had begun to inform social acceptance. The half-buried cabin that once drew laughter had become the reference point for innovation in fire and weather-resistant construction. As spring advanced, Harrow's ongoing documentation continued to guide both replication and refinement. Minor adjustments were made to drainage, soil compaction, and vegetation management, demonstrating the adaptability and scalability of the design. While Harrow remained cautious in promoting his methods, the combination of repeated success, empirical validation, and growing professional recognition ensured that the cabin's principles were firmly established as a credible model. Clearview Ridge, scarred yet enduring, now bore not only the marks of environmental challenge but also evidence of emerging innovation. Harrow's cabin and the structures inspired by it stood as enduring symbols of methodical observation, practical experimentation, and the gradual transformation of skepticism into informed respect. The next and final phase would consolidate the cabin's long-term validation and legacy, completing its transition from curiosity to historically acknowledged innovation. April 1925 marked a turning point for Granite Creek. With the snow fully melted and spring vegetation emerging, the valley and surrounding ridges offered a clear view of both the environmental challenges and the results of Harrow's unconventional construction methods. The half-buried cabin, now more than a year old, had withstood wildfire, drought, windstorm, rain, and winter snow. While replicated structures, small cottages, and storage buildings inspired by its design had begun to demonstrate consistent resilience, the empirical record was no longer confined to Harrow's meticulous journals. It was visible across the landscape. Local engineers, foresters, and even visiting civil survey officials began to formally acknowledge the design principles. Reports circulated beyond Granite Creek, describing the performance of earth-sheltered structures under varied environmental stressors. Key findings highlighted the cabin's capacity to moderate internal temperature, absorb thermal shock, resist fire, and maintain structural integrity under snow and rainfall. The combination of practical demonstration and rigorous observation had elevated the cabin from an experimental oddity to a recognized model of resilience. Harrow, ever methodical, continued to refine minor aspects of the cabin. Drainage channels were adjusted, soil compaction techniques were slightly modified for new constructions, and the management of sod vegetation on the roof was optimized to maximize insulation and prevent erosion. Despite these refinements, his approach remained observational rather than promotional. The credibility of his work stemmed from empirical evidence rather than persuasion. By mid-April, the broader community's attitude had transformed. Residents who had once mocked or dismissed the half-buried cabin now consulted Harrow for guidance on building resilient homes and storage structures. Early adopters of replicated designs reported satisfaction with thermal performance and fire resistance, further validating the effectiveness of the methods. The cabin's influence began to extend beyond Clearview Ridge, with builders in nearby valleys experimenting with earthen insulation, slope placement, and partial subterranean construction. Over time, Harrow's work became referenced in local and regional building discussions as a model for fire and weather-resistant architecture. Though initially considered unconventional, the combination of repeated environmental testing, technical acknowledgement, and practical demonstration ensured that the principles he employed would inform construction practices for decades. His half-buried cabin, once the subject of ridicule, had become a tangible lesson in the value of empirical observation, methodical experimentation, and cautious innovation. By late spring, the ridge itself bore witness to a quiet transformation. The landscape was now punctuated with small, earth-sheltered buildings, each reflecting the principles established by Harrow. Community leaders began to acknowledge the broader implications. Construction need not conform rigidly to tradition, and unconventional approaches, if rigorously tested, could offer superior resilience. Harrow's cabin had achieved what few experimental structures ever did. It had shifted perceptions, informed practice, and left a lasting imprint on regional architectural thought. In retrospective accounts compiled over the following decades, Harrow's cabin was cited as an early example of sustainable, environmentally responsive design. Its endurance under multiple environmental extremes, coupled with systematic documentation and cautious dissemination of knowledge, provided a template for architects, engineers, and builders who sought to balance tradition with innovation. The cabin's legacy extended beyond its physical structure. It demonstrated that careful observation, empirical evidence, and methodical testing could transform ridicule into recognition, skepticism into adoption, and experimental design into enduring architectural principle. Clearview Ridge, once the site of laughter and doubt, had become a testament to resilience, foresight, and the quiet power of unconventional solutions. Harrow's cabin stood at the center of this transformation, a living example of how one measured, deliberate choice, half-buried, earth-insulated, and meticulously observed, could withstand the trials of fire, water, wind, and snow, ultimately leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the ridge itself. The structure's endurance and influence served as a reminder that innovation, even when initially dismissed, could become a cornerstone of lasting practice when guided by reason, evidence, and patience.